you've had a long journey with PTSD.
And trained to take a small group of people into enemy territory and kill other people. And in order to do that, I had to learn every single weapon system that was available at that time in my career in the early 70s. I've tried a ton of therapies. I got a lot of stabilization, but I didn't get to the next piece.
Can you speak to a little bit of how the Navajo tradition came in?
What's interesting about the Navajo is that I had a complete transformation, and it continued for like 48 hours. The key thing with trauma at any model, at any level, is first you got to
meet Dr. Michael Shea. He is a formal student of the Dalai Lama and an apprentice to the Navajo medicine people, a pioneer who can trace trauma to our very first breath. In 1986, he became one of the first certificates of craniosacral therapy, and he is now the assistant professor in embryology and prenatal psychology at the University Institute of Santa Barbara. He is the creator of biodynamic cardiovascular therapy. This is Dr. Michael Shea, and he knows where our story really began.
Spirit draws what spirit is seeing. When the trance was broken and he came out, he said,
Welcome back to the Boundless Body. So check this out. 63.5% of you who are regular listeners haven't subscribed yet to the show. So please take a moment. It would be really helpful to click subscribe. It's free of charge. It will really help us out. In turn, we'll help you out by bringing you better and better content. Along those lines, send us an email with your feedback, boundlessbodypod@gmail.com. Send us your feedback about how you think we can do better. Give us questions to address on the show, interviewees you'd like us to interview. It'd be super helpful. Okay. Let's be a community.
Okay, I'm really excited to have Dr. Michael Shea with me today. Hey, Michael.
Hey, Brian, good to see you.
Good to see you. I was remembering that, I have a brother named Michael and you have a brother named Brian.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah, it's been a while. It's been since about 2010. And, there was this epic workshop we were involved in New Zealand where we were doing a biodynamic craniosacral workshop on primary respiration.
Right.
In a structure on stilts above the water in New Zealand. And it was just incredible.
Yeah, it was a floating boathouse, and they had a deck where you could actually sit and just look at the horizon. I mean, it was a beautiful, beautiful environment for teaching biodynamic work, for sure.
That was incredible. Okay, so I'm going to just read your bio off just so that folks can be introduced to you if they aren't already. So Michael Shea is one of the preeminent educators and authors in the fields of somatic psychology, myofascial release, and craniosacral therapy. He leads seminars throughout the US, Canada, and Europe. Dr. Shea was certified as one of the first full instructors of craniosacral therapy by the Upledger Institute in 1986 and was an advanced Rolfer for 20 years. He completed his doctorate in somatic psychology at the Union Institute. So Michael is a formal student of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and past apprentice with a medicine man on the Navajo reservation in Arizona. He has written 8 books, 8, right?
Yep, you got it.
8 books, including the influential 5-volume series about biodynamic craniosacral work, very much on my shelf back there. His latest book is called, with a lot of underlines and highlights and underlines and highlights. His latest book is called The Biodynamic Heart, which articulates his innovative therapy called biodynamic cardiovascular therapy. So there it is right there. And welcome, Michael.
Hey, Brian, thank you. What a joy to see you again. It's been a long time. So let's have some fun with this.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Well, let's see here. There's a lot of compelling stuff in your book. One of the things that's just, and I didn't know this about you, that you're a vet. And I was just mind blown by this introductory piece about baptism in blood.
Yeah.
As a preface into talking about the biodynamics of blood.
Yes, absolutely, because the blood carries the spiritual essence, of who we are. So absolutely.
So that's not, and then you really bring the reader into this tableau of intensity and trauma. And I didn't know that about you, that you've had a long journey with PTSD.
Well, the interesting thing, Brian, I didn't know I was going to become an expert in trauma, but it wasn't until 10 years after I got out of the service that PTSD was even named. So I kind of floated around for 10 years, in the universe, in a very alternative universe, just trying to wake up the instinct for self-healing. And before any type of, marginal orientation to PTSD even happened in our culture or in the veteran military culture, for sure.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book that at Naropa, where you did your graduate work, they didn't even mention PTSD or trauma, right?
No, and that's the other interesting piece. And the reason I went there is because I knew I was, kind of crazy. I knew I had some challenges, and I could feel and notice the symptoms, but I couldn't name them. I just thought, oh, that's who I am. I wasn't linking them. But the reality is that I blew a disc in my neck and I lost my Rolfing career overnight. And that's why I went to Naropa. But I also knew that I needed some kind of help for something. And I still wasn't, putting the things together. But I went, I had therapy 3 times a week. That was part of the deal at Naropa. I had group therapy, individual therapy, 3 times a week for almost 3 years. So I think the key thing with trauma at any model, at any level, is first you got to stabilize. And so that 3 years at Naropa really helped stabilize me, but it also introduced me to, and the degree is in contemplative psychotherapy, and now we have the named field of contemplative neuroscience. So I spend a lot of time now looking at the literature on contemplative neuroscience, and I have a spiritual orientation in my life for contemplative practices and the ones that are also research-based.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Stabilization. That was one of the words in my taglines on my website. Stabilize, catalyze, thrive, Michael.
Well, Brian, for me, it's stabilize, transform. And I think what I've noticed in let's say the trauma therapies that I've experimented with, because I've tried a ton of therapies, is that I got a lot of stabilization, but I didn't get to the next piece. I didn't get to transform my experience into compassion, into love, into loving kindness, and to transform the history, my personal history, as a spiritual lesson. And I think that's really, for me, one of the keys. And that transformation didn't happen actually until I went through an evidence-based therapy at the Veterans Administration, the prolonged exposure therapy.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, and telling my story like hundreds of times. And in one of the telling of the story in front of a witness, a really great guy, I had a complete transformation, and it continued for like 48 hours of that. The experience I had in this bomb blast was actually a moment of compassion, that it took that level of ignition for me to experience that this is about compassion. Life is about compassion that we have to have for self and for other.
Sounds shamanic. I mean, you mentioned that in the book, where you're holding the dead body of Colonel Bloomquist. Yeah?
Correct.
And the quote there is, "The heart of compassion was birthed in me."
Yep.
That's really beautiful. You go on to relate this also a recovery story with the Navajo. Can you talk how that fit in? Because the prolonged exposure therapy, that's great to hear. I want to come back to that. But can you speak to a little bit of how the Navajo tradition came in?
Well, what's interesting about the Navajo is that in my doctoral work, I wanted to add in a component of working in getting to know traditional systems or shamanic systems. And it was just pure luck that I ran into a Native American healer And he took my wife and I out to the Navajo reservation, and we began this 10-year apprenticeship. And basically, I've received the initiation to perform this type of shamanic ritual and the rituals within their blessing way ceremony, which is quite wonderful. But the long and short of it, Brian, the shaman goes into a trance. So John Nelson, God rest his soul, goes into trance, and his hand starts trembling. So he's what's called a hand trembler. And the trembling goes all over your body, and he periodically takes a break. And then he looks at this sand painting, and he uses his finger. Spirit draws what spirit is seeing. The problem is in my body. This goes on for 20 or 30 minutes. I'm laying there as the patient, and there's a fire going. We're in a hogan. It's a very traditional, setup. There's people singing and praying in the side. I mean, it's an incredible situation. Singing the origin story, that's another dynamic. So basically, when the trance was broken and he came out, he said, okay, let's look at this. And on that sand painting was the drawing of a gun, and it was a big gun. And it was immediately, I went, oh, that's an M60 machine gun. I knew it because I was trained as a military officer. So, trained as a military officer, basically I'm trained to take a small group of people into enemy territory and kill other people. And in order to do that, I had to learn every single weapon system that was available at that time in my career in the early 70s. I would always wait to the end of the line, Brian, and especially the M60 machine gun, because I love to fire it John Wayne style. So now I'm 77. I couldn't even conceive of that, but I know I did that when I was 19 years old. So we're talking about a long time ago, and I'm smiling about it. So I get to the end of the line, and I get to hip fire 3,000 or 5,000 rounds of ammunition. That M60 machine gun got into my heart. And that's what was blocking my heart from the next level of healing that I needed to do for my PTSD. Because of the military experience, the military training during the Vietnam era, I had a lot of that. I grew up in the gun culture. I knew that. So he extracted the M60 machine gun, or I would say spirit extracted that from my heart. That's a really key point here. I came home and got rid of all my guns. I have a gun-free household. I even had a BB gun, and I got rid of the got rid of the BB gun. And it's been a good thing because that is a wake-up call to a deeper sense of safety within myself and the environment I'm in.
Mm-hmm. It's really cool to hear that you had a major breakthrough after all these years and after all this work and the biodynamic work. And I mean, you've done everything under the sun for so many years that you had a major breakthrough with prolonged exposure therapy. Because, with exposure therapy and the CBT informed therapies, there's like this divide in the therapeutic community where the somatics community has their kind of nose up in the air insofar as CBT and exposure models. And it's like, oh, well, those models are heady or something like that. Or there's this anti-intellectualist vein that can run through the somatics community. And so it's really, you get what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
I call it, what do I say? My joke is that somatics folks are the most intellectualists out there.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I did CPT therapy. I started with that, and it was extremely valuable because, Brian, the type of trauma that I experienced is now in the category what's called moral violation, and it created a moral injury. And so, and basically, my cognition and my neurological reflexes had difficulty orienting to what is really right and what is really wrong. And that played out in different ways in my life. CPT really got me oriented around recognizing mentally, emotionally, and in my world the beginning of what is right, what is wrong. And then prolonged exposure therapy got me into the heart of compassion. And right now, I'm almost finished with ACT. I'm doing acceptance and commitment therapy. I got a wonderful therapist, because the moral injury damages the inner value system. So I've been in a process now at the age of 77, really solidifying and identifying what are my true internal values? What do I hold as a value without judging the way other people manage what they consider to be their values? So it's been wonderful that way, because ACT therapy is very Buddhist. I keep telling her, my therapist, I say, you're a Zen Roshi. Come on, you are a Zen Roshi. You've got to admit it. So she laughs a lot. But that's the issue with moral injury and the ability to distinguish right from wrong. And basically, it's been a godsend. It's been very, very helpful, because I get to embody that. The more my cognition and my emotional body can get stabilized and transformed, the more my 5 sense gates of my body get clear, and I become more embodied. And that's a whole other discussion we can have. I'm about to do a presentation at the University of Antwerp next fall on what I'm calling the 7th sense of embodiment, and really what that means. But we can have that conversation later.
Can you take us in for a moment, this moment where you're holding Bloomquist and you got blood on your arms, where the heart of compassion was birthed in me? You take us there in the book. Can you kind of bring us there now and kind of bring us into that space of radical compassion? Well, it's a big ask, but
first of all, you're dealing with a bomb blast. I was very familiar with ordnance. I learned how to blow up bridges and things like that. I mean, I'm pretty good with C4, or I was good with C4 electric detonators and things like that. Again, 19 years old. So the bomb blast, number one. So there's a concussion that happened. So there's a cerebral concussion and there's a cardiovascular concussion on the heart. So I'm dealing with a concussion. And then I'm dealing with encountering people that are bleeding. And so there's a triage thing that's happening. And since it's military, most people are ignoring the bleeding. We're just trying to evacuate the civilians. So there's a stacking of experiences that by the time I got outside and I saw that there was a body on the ground and that there was room for me to help lift the body into the ambulance, I got the corner by I think the right shoulder. And we lifted the body up. And when I looked, the head was barely hanging on, because the shrapnel had pretty much decapitated the man. So I'm hoping that who is ever watching this at least can take a pause and breathe and really know that this happens on a regular basis with so many military people, not just American soldiers, and it also happens, in civilian life as well. So accidents like this can happen, but this was a terrorist bombing attack. So I'm lifting a body that's basically headless and we're putting it into the ambulance. And it wasn't until years later that I actually remember looking up and I could see the spirit of Colonel Bloomquist. And I could see him sitting in the trees because my imagination is that the bomb blast actually, blew his consciousness, whatever that might be, out. And he's now looking down at the circumstance. And it wasn't until I did therapy, Brian, some years later, and it was the prolonged exposure therapy, that I looked in his eyes. And it was there that I received his blessing. And it was actually a blessing because he was a war hero. We're talking about a man that stayed in Vietnam, and he was a medevac pilot, and he evacuated 9,000 wounded American soldiers. He also evacuated 8,000 dead American soldiers from the battlefield. He was a highly decorated human being. And it was in that shamanic moment where we made eye contact, where he said, "You carry this tradition. You carry this tradition of this gigantic compassion to help wounded people and to help people that are dying. So, Brian, I've kind of dedicated my last 2 or 3 years of my life to death and dying, and the coursework I've been doing in the past year is on death and dying. And the first section in that book is dealing with sorrow, sadness, grief, and death and dying. So for me, this birth of compassion and this empowerment that I got from Colonel Bloomquist regarding compassion in helping other human beings, including those who are dying, that's a critical need in our culture right now, Brian. There's a lot more people dying than they actually know, and death by metabolic syndrome is not pleasant. And the majority of our population, the majority of our client base, my client base, and the people that I work with both in Europe, here in the United States, the majority are dealing with metabolic syndrome. And it's very difficult to undo. It can be undone, but the medical route doesn't work that effectively, especially with some of the pharmaceuticals. And so these people are destined to die. And I believe that in the somatic domain, that much of my work now is palliative. I teach palliative touch as much as anything else. When you've got someone with cancer, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and they aren't doing the lifestyle changes necessary to really heal their body and to heal the cells at that so-called telomere level that we all hear about. Oh, my telomeres are damaged, because I'm eating junk food. Yeah, you've been eating it a long time, and there's a lot of telomeres. So, at any rate, so that's kind of the long and short of it, the birth of compassion. So,
you have this beautiful phrase about the spiritual enzyme of sadness, spiritual.
Right.
I think that's really beautiful. I think that public grieving rituals are in order, grieving together, being sad together, just being in that space of the potency and the beauty and the love of sorrow.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I coach people in my therapy when I'm doing therapy is, sorrow is a gift. It shows us that we're alive, that we care, that we long for. That we long for something more.
Yeah, Brian, thank you, because this is a fabulous piece, and it's a heart opener, because the book is about opening our heart, and I think that's where we're at. I did a lot of work with David Kessler a couple of years ago. I've been studying and taking coursework on death and dying for probably 15 years right now, and David Kessler is like the big international authority now on grieving. And I got to really think about and get the embodied sense of what sorrow and sadness is within the dynamic of grieving. And that's when I realized that sorrow is a ferment. What happens in grief when you've got a proper ferment is that the love you had for the one that's lost gets to grow and gets to expand. And you need a ferment for that. It's like sourdough bread. And sadness and sorrow are the ferment. And I have a lighthearted, because I'm Irish, and I can tell a joke in a moment's notice. And my classes all know that they can raise their hand and ask for a joke whenever they want. And I also can cry and be sad and be sorrowful as much as anything else. But I don't buy into depression. I don't go down that path, because I know it's transient and I know it's important. And sorrow and sadness are warmth. It's embodied warmth. I love feeling that warmth around my heart. It's a beautiful feeling.
Yeah, there's this beautiful line from Rilke. I can just savor it every time I say it. The only place that grief can go is the place that praise already is.
Yeah.
It's just so beautiful. I want to just kind of get back in the time machine and go someplace else. And that's because another thing that we share, Michael, is a Rolfing history. I was a structural integration practitioner for 8 or 10 years until I blew my shoulder out on a Samoan.
I know that. I can relate to that, Brian. Thank you.
Could you talk to us a little bit about Rolfing, and let's talk a little bit about fascia, and then maybe your segue into infant work. And then that'll be one ecology that'll be interlocking with our discussion about craniosacral work.
I got out of Rolfing, God, it was like 20 or 25 years ago. So I can give you a little bit of my history. And I love talking about fascia, but I'm not that much of an expert in it now, although I do follow some of that literature from the international congresses on fascia. And I think the latest international congress on fascia just happened not too long ago. Brian, when I got my massage license in 1975, 76, there were only 12 schools of massage therapy in the entire United States. And I happened to choose one because I could go on the GI Bill in Miami. When you get out of massage school in 1975, there is no continuing education in the United States except for 3 schools, one of which was the Rolf Institute. So I got involved with Rolfing because there was a local Rolfer. I got my 10 steps and so forth. And I wanted to keep moving and progressing in the manual therapeutic arts. So I ended up going to Boulder in 1979, and that's when I did my basic Rolf training. And in the early 80s, did my advanced Rolf training and so forth. And I threw myself at the study of fascia. And I think that's a very, very important study, although I'm not as familiar with it now as, let's say, Robert Schleip. Are you familiar with Robert Schleip's work? He's really kind of the go-to guy, and there are others, but I also teach in Germany. So I have a lot of teachers in training and also assistants that do a lot of fascial work, and they also know Robert Schleip personally. So I stay in touch with the fascial work. And here's the thing about fascia for me, Brian, without getting into anatomy and physiology, my interest right now, and I have to say, I'm not that much interested in anatomy and physiology anymore. I know it, and I will study it when necessary, when they discover a new organ like the mesentery or so you go, oh my God, there's a new organ.
Or they call an organ that was already there the interstitium. Right. That now the fascia is called an organ, the interstitium. Yeah.
And I think that's the point, because here's the key teaching for me, and that is, anatomy is to physiology as metabolism is to our instincts. So
great. Can you say that again? I love that.
Anatomy is to physiology, which I had 50 years of study, and as instincts are to metabolism.
Brilliant.
Brian, the problem that people are having now is with their metabolism. I'm sorry, it's not their physiology, it's not their anatomy, it's their metabolism. This is the problem with trauma resolution. It does not recognize that trauma is a metabolic problem, that when you're traumatized, it creates leaky gut syndrome. And that's where the inflammatory process starts. But we're on a little sidetrack there.
Well, that lines up something that I wanted to talk about later. Okay. So I'm going to bookmark that.
Yeah. So my study for the last 10 years, I'm not a biochemist, I'm not a cell biologist, but I got to know enough of it to understand what metabolism is and how molecules function and how that relates to biodynamic practice and help to, for people to tie that in. And so metabolism means that we have to get in touch with our instincts for self-preservation, for self-healing, and the instinct for self-transcendence. These are all instincts that when you work within the skills, the techniques, and the perceptual processes associated with those instincts, you're going to have an effect on the metabolism, which will then have an effect on the physiology, and then consequently the anatomy and so forth. So that's been the root of the piece for me right now. When it comes to fascia, the reason the fascia is metabolically disrupted, and I've had this conversation with a lot of Rolfers in Europe, is because the lymphatic system can no longer handle the inflammatory byproducts and waste products from the inflammatory process. It gets backed up into the lymphatic system. It then gets backed up into the interstitium, and from the interstitium, the waste products then interfere with the metabolic functioning, especially of the fascia and the way we maintain our posture and so forth, and management of all sorts of injuries and orthopedic injuries. They're not going to go away until you deal with the metabolism. But that has to do with the focus on the immune system, that has to do with the focus on detoxification and clearing out the waste products. My wife and I work at a very prestigious clinic in Switzerland. It's called Biomedicine International. Dr. Thomas Rao, brilliant physician. And he's brilliant because he's a specialist in healing and resolving metabolic problems, because that's the era we live in. Our contemporary client has metabolic problems, and that's what has to be addressed. And these techniques from traditional societies, from the Bun tradition, from Tibetan medicine, from Taoism, these are all making a comeback because they're targeted and they orient towards metabolism.
Yeah. Healing is to like support the garbage dump process.
Here, Brian, in the book I did before this called On the Biodynamics of the Immune System, I call the kitchen the new ER, and I call the bathroom the new ICU, because that's the living reality that we're in right now. People are eating junk, and they got to start taking enemas, and they got to start sweating, doing infrared. They've got to start getting the junk out. And until you can start doing upbuilding of the lining of the intestine, these physicians in Europe, Brian, they're the ones we follow are saying the same thing. And that is, all disease process is rooted in the gut, in the small intestine, in the lining of the small intestine. So this, again, we're looping into metabolic and metabolic challenges, but we're also looping into how do we support our instinctual process and get clear on our instinctual processes that are governing this.
Yeah. So how did you start getting into the infant work? Because you were Rolfing infants. Yeah?
I forget the name of the guy. There was a Rolfer in Philadelphia when I first got into the Institute in like 1979, I think is the year I was in, or 1980. And, it's one of those things, Brian, I don't have a purpose-driven life. I don't have a mission in life. I just let life come to me. And I saw that there was a Rolfer who was Rolfing kids that had cerebral palsy. And I went, Brian, let me tell you, I just got to be honest with you. After like 5,000 massages and 5,000 Rolfing sessions on adults, it's like, oh my God, I am so tired of working on big bodies because it's hard work. Maybe God could bring me some smaller bodies to work on. I'm serious. And it's like, and that was one of my motivations, but it was also a motivation for compassion. It's very difficult for me looking at a child who can't walk correctly or the neurological problems that these kids have. And it was just what interested me. And that interested me, but I didn't reach out for that. It interested me. And that was the another wake up for compassion of seeing suffering children. And I write about that in the book. And it wasn't until I had a therapist, because I was a traveling Rolfer. I went all over North Dakota, New Orleans, Cincinnati, Ohio, go in, you do 40 sessions, you get paid cash, you walk home, you're feeling good. And then I blew a disc.
And then you also get your sadistic needs met.
What's that? Wow. Right. Well, yes, there is the finger caught up the nose, like the real self. I stopped doing that when I got accused of more than one patient saying that they were being abused. And I went, well, that's not my motivation to abuse someone. So maybe it's the technique I shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
So I stopped doing the nose
finger
work.
Up the nose technique. Yeah. Classic Rolfing.
Well, and and the mouth work too. And I'm not a big believer in mouth work, but I will do it because it has its value and it's not as abusive potentially as let's say the nose work. But I got a pediatric physical therapist flew to Boulder to get 10 sessions with me. And at the end of the 10th session, she said, look, I have a practice working on kids. Would you fly to Cincinnati and would you evaluate my entire practice? Because all these kids have orthopedic problems because they're developmentally delayed from brain damage at birth, during birth, before birth, et cetera. I said, yeah, sure, no problem. I had zero experience. I didn't know that infant anatomy was different than adult anatomy. But it all worked out because I'm a student and I started looking at infant anatomy. I started studying it. But you know what I did first, Brian? I went into the room and I formed a relationship with these children. I met them eye to eye. I got introduced to them. I started talking to them. And after that, I started doing the coursework on how to get better in that. I did Ray Castellino's process training, a lot of that stuff that was going on in that era, in the 80s and 90s. But that's how I got involved with kids. And one thing led to another, and I just loved it. I mean, I became specialized in working with children who were in a persistent vegetative state, who were just vegetative. And I love working with them because, Brian, every sentient being, every human being, every child, no matter how damaged they were from parents that tortured them, and that's in the book as well, or from brain damage from birth and so forth, they all were able to communicate with me. They all had communication systems that I could tune into and we could relate at that level. And then from there, get permission to do the hands-on work. And as I wrote in the book, they taught me compassion. Brian, when you've got a child come in that's been tortured as an infant, and I don't want to tell that story because it's a horror. And I was exposed to this level of horror in my practice. And you hear this story, and there were the different set of parents now. Obviously, they're in foster care and so forth. But when you hear these stories, and I look back and I go, why me? And it's like, because this is your path. This is your path of compassion. You had a bombing experience. You made a U-turn into your future. You're not going to law school because I come from a family of attorneys. You're going to do something else with your life. And these children taught me what to do. They taught me how to open my heart, not only to them, but to family systems. When I treat a child, I always try to treat the mother first. The children that have died that I've worked on that were already terminal, you've got the whole family system present. Sometimes there's 8 or 9 extended family members present when I'm working with a terminal child with a terminal diagnosis. And I love getting those phone calls. My so-and-so died last night, but they died with a smile on their face, and we want to thank you, Dr. Shea. So it's a beautiful experience, and compassion, again, we're coming back to that and how that woke up in me. And these children taught me that.
Yeah. I was doing biodynamic craniosacral work at a cancer clinic in New Zealand for years. So just 8 hours a day, boom, 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 boom. And one of those, one of the clients that I'd been working with, terminal cancer client, I hadn't seen him. I worked on him with him for, basically 2 years, I think, and hadn't seen him in a bit. And he was asking for me, where's, I need to go see Brian. And he came in, and after about 40 minutes, he just peacefully passed away right in my hands.
Yeah.
Just such a beautiful. And then, the Maori community, because he's a Maori man, came in and did ceremony right there in my office. Like,
wow. Did they do would they do probably something maybe similar to the haka that they do? But
well, no, it was a little bit Christianized. But the point is that it was just awe-inspiring. It was one of these moments where the goosebump responses.
Yeah.
I actually write a fair bit about involuntary piloerection, the goosebump response, because I find that clinically and teaching and whatnot that, if we're really in the zone, if we're really in the breath of life, then the tingle response is right there.
Yeah.
Like, in fact,
Yep.
I just had it a bit, just invoking it in that way.
Well, Brian, back to the conversation we just had. So you're already very knowledgeable in working with metabolic conditions. If you've done 10 years of work with cancer patients, I'm just starting into that domain. For the last 2 years, most of my patients, have cancer. So you already have a skill level working metabolically with craniosacral therapy. And it's amazing how craniosacral therapy can interface with metabolism. And I have a reason for that, because we focus on slowness and stillness. And that's really what reorients metabolism in a healthy way, is just slowness and stillness at the perceptual and palpatory level. I don't know if you would agree with that or
Oh, absolutely. 100%, 100%. By way of orienting folks that don't, because I haven't talked much about craniosacral on the podcast. So I'm wondering if we can get at defining it and talking about it through the story of your life. Like, in other words, how you segued as a Rolfer into craniosacral work and your early work with the Upledger Institute. And meanwhile, like, as you kind of talk about your own personal journey, can you define some of the core principles of craniosacral work, just for the listener who's not oriented to them?
Well, craniosacral therapy, when we talk about lineage and history, I think that's important. And that is that I was certified by John Upledger, an osteopath, but he's an osteopath. And that work originally came from William Garner Sutherland, who was an osteopath at the turn of the century. And he learned his anatomy and physiology from the founder of osteopathy, Andrew Taylor Still. And the reason I say that, Brian, is that I'd like to start off by saying craniosacral therapy is a spiritually based manual therapy and a manual therapeutic art, because it derived from osteopathy primarily. And there's other lineages now that impacted, but in the actual lineages, it was handed down. William Garner Sutherland and Andrew Taylor Still both had a very deep rooted spirit. And by that, I mean the principle that started osteopathy by Andrew Taylor Still, that we are a unity of mind, body, and spirit. So the intention and the focus within craniosacral therapy, as I know it and as I learned it, includes the spiritual dimension. Andrew Taylor Still started it. And then William Garner Sutherland in 1943 said that if you consider osteopathy to be spiritual, then the cranial concept is very spiritual, is also spiritual. So we're in a domain right now where, because of the metabolic problems and the challenges we're having, that this type of work, which is light touch, is very effective, because you don't have to be a priest or a priestess or a monk, or you don't have to be belong to a religion or anything like that to practice this work, because spiritual just means, a deep heart, that you've got a deep heart of compassion, and that you've got an empathetic process going on, and you at least have a relationship with your mind, knowing when you're going crazy. We're humans and we go crazy emotionally with our thoughts and with our concepts. So if we have some kind of check and balances right there, then we're kind of on a spiritual path, because we know how to calm down and we can see clearly what needs to happen next. Craniosacral therapy, as a spiritually based therapy, has a basic principle of slowness and stillness, in which the therapist is attempting to perceive within themselves a slow rhythm and become still, at least with their posture and perhaps their thoughts and their emotions. And we know, and I think you know this as well, because you're really in the neuroscience, probably more so than I am, but at the level interpersonal neurobiology and affective neuroscience, the therapist has to be in their own soma, within their own sensorium first, and have a level of mindfulness and awareness before putting their hands on. So then the putting on of the hands allows the client and the therapist to synchronize with slowness and stillness, which is what this craniosacral therapy does because of the specific points on the body in which contact is made that has a direct influence on the central nervous system, on the cardiovascular system, and so forth in a very valuable way. It allows the molecules of the body to help reorganize at the level of metabolism. And I don't know if one of the things that blew me away, Brian, was that the research on molecules and molecular transformation, all molecules on the planet Earth, human beings, scaled across the entire universe, they have to go through a still point in order for transformation to occur into the next chemical bond or whatever it is that they're doing. So we know from biological stillness and biological quiescence, there's 6 or 7 systems of the human body that are called quiescent. For instance, the endothelium, the lining of the artery, are made of quiescent cells. And when they're inflamed, they lose their quiescence and they speed up. The center of blood flow is dynamically still. Doppler radar studies have shown that. So here we have the attempt by a craniosacral therapist to calm themselves and get inner peace, stillness, and to slow down. And that synchronizes, and the client reads that unconsciously, neurologically, and their system will start to respond positively to that. And when you add that to the potency of the hand-to-hand contact, electromagnetically and otherwise, then you've got a winning combination. And that's why it's an international phenomenon, and it's still a growing field. I could, well, if we got another 3 hours, I'll do a 3-hour, but I don't want, that's the long and short of it. It's spiritual. It's about slowing and stilling and becoming still.
Talk about a little bit about the transition from Rolfing kids, infants, to treating them from the craniosacral perspective.
Well, that's a beautiful piece because I lived that transition where the first 5 or 6 years, the kids, and there were a lot of myofascial release teachers within the physical therapy community and within the occupational therapy community. And so the therapists were originally, initially learning to do myofascial release and releasing the fascia. And then all of a sudden in the late 80s and early 90s, the cranial paradigm began to occur. And so there being that shift from myofascial, or at least wise including craniosacral, because craniosacral therapy can have more of a direct impact on the brain and the neurological system of the infant. And so the PTs started doing what they called craniosacral therapy camps. And they would have a camp because they just love bringing tons of kids in. It's not a one-on-one situation. Let's bring 20 kids in and we'll just start working. We'll go from kid to kid and we'll do what we need to do. We'll do some four-handed work. We'll do some two-handed work. So I got involved with coaching and teaching in these craniosacral therapy camps for the pediatric physical therapist and the pediatric occupational therapist. And then I was asked to put together a program, a year-long training program combining the both of them at the Miami Children's Hospital. It was a long time ago. It was like 30 years ago. It really coalesced at that level. I haven't been involved in that community too much, but all the people that I trained in pediatric physical therapy, the midwives that I've trained and all that, they are still doing a lot of the biodynamic craniosacral therapy, which is what craniosacral therapy morphed into, so to speak.
One of the things that you probably don't know about me is that I purchased, this is back maybe 2010. I purchased like 60 CDs from you or something like that. And it was this entire pediatric training where I was driving in my car in New Zealand, listening to Michael, Josh around and, just like, you got a great sense. I love your sense of humor. And I took one of these pediatric trainings and I was blown away by it. And some of the stories, these just beautiful stories of working with these pediatric cases, just mind blowing.
Yeah, I've mentioned that my publisher asked me for 4 more books, and although I'm working on one now, an embryology, the next one I want to do, and I did a consult with it yesterday from one of the contributors, is on the pediatric approach, because I really think we need to know how to integrate pre and perinatal psychology into the somatic paradigm. And the biodynamic embryology book I'm writing now is going to be more or less focused on morphology and embodiment and integration into the classroom and clinical skills. But then the next book really has to include context and pre and perinatal psychology and the whole notion of pregnancy and development in general. So I'm really jazzed about that. I hope I live long enough to bring these books to fruition.
I hope so too. And then, so you also, didn't you work at the Santa Barbara Graduate Institute for a bit?
Well, that was the thing. And I was their embryologist on staff for 3 or 4 years, and I was on a number of doctoral committees. So I taught in the PhD program of somatic psychology, but I also primarily was teaching in the pre and perinatal psychology doctoral program. And so I taught human embryology from a phenomenological point of view, from a biodynamic and morphological point of view, to these doctoral students in both of those programs for about 3 years. I became an academic embryologist almost overnight, but that's also embedded within biodynamic craniosacral therapy and the therapy that I've evolved with biodynamic cardiovascular therapy.
So there's a lot of terms in there that I know that I'm imagining that the listener might not necessarily know. So for example, pre and perinatal psychology, let's define that. Let's talk about why it's important. Because I can say Santa Barbara Graduate Institute and know what that is and what they're involved in. Right. And I have a knowledge base about pre and perinatal psychology, but the listener, can you qualify that? What is pre and perinatal psychology? Why is it important for somatic psychology?
Well, again, there's a number of ways of defining that, and I would like to keep it simple because I'm a man, and I used to teach courses on pregnancy and prenatal development outside of embryology, and I got a lot of pushback from women who say a man can't know that, and I'm okay with that. I'm really okay with that. So I'm going to sit here as a man and define pre and perinatal psychology, especially the prenatal part of it. It's not really a definition because pre and perinatal psychology is not really, to my way of thinking, a coalesced field yet. It's still working through some academic pieces, some taxonomy pieces. It's working through, it doesn't even yet have a body of knowledge as far as I know. So basically, we're talking about when, as a human being, Brian, do we have a consciousness, and can we access a consciousness of selfhood, a knowing of selfhood, of here I am a zygote, here I am having an experience, when I'm 1 week post-fertilization. And that lends itself to an esoteric component. There's a lot of writing in the field of how the pregnant mom, or even before she's pregnant, gets a message from the being that wants to incarnate. So there's a strong spiritual component of the incarnation of a being coming into form in the woman's body from the male sperm, and in that connection. So there's a continuity, as they say in Tibetan Buddhism, within the bardo of becoming, where the being chooses to come in. So that's the essence at the beginning. Jim Jealous, when I asked him what the most important part of the ignition process in biodynamic, he just said annunciation. That the annunciation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, that she was pregnant, was the most important part for him of biodynamic craniosacral therapy. So the essence of a divine being coming in, because all of us have that potential of divinity of coming in. But then there's the issue of how does that evolve and develop? So we have the issue of the pregnant mom and her psychology and her family system of origin and the whole ancestral dynamic that comes through the mother and the father. So there is that component to it. And then you have a major component with the birthing process. So the birthing process now, within perinatal psychology, there's a huge attempt to undo the way in which Western medicine has medicalized the birth process. And that's a major part of pre and perinatal psychology. It's a major way in which we receive what they call imprints, a psychological imprint of a trauma that occurred during the birth process, or a psychological imprint on our cell metabolism from a prenatal experience. And then you have the perinatal dynamic associated with the beginning of affective neuroscience that kind of begins at birth. And the first 12 months of life in the affective neuroscience paradigm are the 3 stages of how the brain develops in relationship. So pre and perinatal psychology gets into relational dynamics, relational dynamics with mom, with spirit, and with the environment of the caregivers that they're providing in the 4 stages of attachment and bonding that are noted within the affective neuroscience community. And I don't know how it is now, Brian, but Alan Shore and Daniel Siegel were kind of king of the heap. You know, they hold the patent on affective neuroscience, so to speak. And I'm kind of out of that loop right now. I got to know Alan Shore, and I've been on the dais with Daniel Siegel. I think his first book on embodied mind is the most brilliant book I've ever read on interpersonal neurobiology. It shifted my world. It really did, in the understanding of the therapeutic relationship. And so I would say finally about pre and perinatal psychology, that when we're with a client, no matter what age, no matter what experience we have as a therapist, we are still have the potential to mimic that early childhood experience of the caregiving experience, because it's imprinted, and we have to know that. And we can also change our perception and work with our perception in order to overcome, let's say, negative imprints. So that's kind of the long and short of it, and other people might define it differently. But you're familiar. I mean, does this sound like I'm in the ballpark?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I taught, biodynamic craniosacral students for years. And so we're in the biodynamic model, and we're working with birth imprints. It's just part of the curriculum.
No.
But also through lived experience, as a man, of course, I was circumcised, and that's one of the things, just as an example of an imprint.
Right. Right.
And that's, it's really intuitive to me because, like when I saw videos, for example, of a circumcision, I just immediately burst out into tears,
Wow.
Birth as We Know It, that classic documentary by Elena Tenetti. Classic. And in that documentary, they show a circumcision surgery.
Right.
And when I saw that, I just burst out into tears because I knew that I was subjected to that. But, it's still, I live in Silicon Valley now, Michael. I work with software tech people, and, I do trauma resolution work. And when I'm working with biodynamic students and with, people that are already they're kind of already initiated into the woo and into the esoteric, and they have a sense of knowing themselves. It's kind of intuitive. Birth trauma is kind of an intuitive thing, but it's a huge leap for like the average Joe Schmo that's coming into my office. I don't know if these people come into your office anymore, but do these people come into your office anymore?
Brian, I spent 30 or 40 years in my career, in being really saturated with the birth paradigm. I don't really work with that anymore.
I
I'm
know
so
it becomes, yeah. Well, keep going. I don't want to get on my soapbox
yeah.
about it,
Well,
but
I
let's
mean,
have you soapbox about it a little bit, like about
yeah.
why.
Well, I'm working on the death and dying paradigm. So the other end of it, but it's interesting you mentioned that about circumcision, and here we are, two men, and I think it's important that we can have this conversation, and especially around the birth imprint with that. And my birth imprinting was so strong that the notion of circumcision, and yes, I am circumcised, was not as heavy as an imprint is. My mother was drugged out beyond belief, and she
Mm,
was proud of it. It was ether on demand.
mm,
And she also had 2 helpings and maybe 3 of twilight sleep, of scopolamine and all of that, which severely dysregulates the parasympathetic nervous system.
mm,
So I am birthed into a world where I am drugged beyond belief. So I
mm,
probably didn't even feel the
mm.
circumcision at this point,
Yeah.
or at that point in my life. So, but I'm still dealing with the drug imprint, and I think that's the key for me.
Yeah.
I am still dealing with that imprint. I did a lot of recreational drugs after the terrorist bombing attack. I had a daily usage of something. If it wasn't LSD, it was mescaline, and if it wasn't mescaline, it was some synthetic drug. And if it wasn't hash, it was hash with opioids in it. And
Mhm.
then it was back to the United States. It's marijuana, and then it was MDMA, and so this was a stage of going through trauma resolution, of just
Mhm.
stabilizing my body to get through the day. And I have to say that I'm fortunate, because at my age now, the drug imprint has started to really minimize, because I'm enjoying meditation a lot more than I am a marijuana gummy with 10 milligrams in order to get through an anxiety attack. Because I periodically have an anxiety attack that's left over from the bombing, but I'm able to manage it more, and I don't always need to go to a recreational drug. I can go to a meditation, I can go to exercise, I can go for a walk on the beach. So,
Mhm.
but thank you for bringing that up, because it's the recognition of what we came into the world with and what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
And the birth is important, but now death and
Yeah.
dying is more important in terms of people's lives and what they're dealing with. I haven't seen a birth. Well, of course, I'm not looking for it anymore. It depends on what you're looking for. I'm trying to help people die a good death. That's what I'm trying to do now.
Yeah, and if somebody's dying and they're on their deathbed and you're really there holding them, you're not going to be talking about their trauma and their birth imprint, right? That you know what I mean? So like we were talking before we clicked record, we were talking about the limitations of trauma discourse, and I said this phrase that I just love. It comes from Ruth Lays, and it goes like this: trauma discourse has become traumatizing. And that's one of the things with the pre and perinatal community, and kind of like the shadow that, as this kind of like rising sun of trauma discourse comes up, and everybody's talking trauma and intergenerational trauma and trauma, there's a shadow that it casts, right? And yeah, and that shadow is orienting to excessive, an excessive orientation to fragility, for example. And it's just like everything becomes trauma. So then if we're constantly talking about trauma, it's going to be traumatizing. It's annoying.
Right, Brian. I thank you for this. And I don't want to diss the trauma resolution community, although I think they've got a lot to learn in terms of metabolism, because they're not talking about metabolism. They're not talking about how trauma interferes with intestinal function, and that's really, what really needs to be a focus. You
Mhm.
know, I love Robert Thurman. He's a professor emeritus of Far East Buddhist studies at Columbia University, and he's a brilliant guy. Anytime he puts something out, but he said, "We are the trauma species."
Mhm.
And once you get that, that's as a species, what we specialize in. If you want to look at it embryonically, we see that most mammals, at the end of the embryonic period, they grow certain appendages and certain physiological and metabolic capabilities to survive the environment that they're getting into, to kill, to claw, to chew, to whatever. Human beings don't do any of that at the end of the embryonic period. We are the trauma species. We're wide open when we're born. There's trauma in. You don't even want to even define trauma, because there's a degree of sensitivity that really doesn't make sense in terms of defining trauma. But through this process, that we're the trauma species, and I'm not excusing that the heinous trauma that goes on and say, "Oh, get over it." That's not what I'm saying either. Mm-hmm. But I'm saying that we have to learn how to specialize in self-healing, in how to take care of ourselves, because that's the instinctual level. And Eastern systems of medicine know that we have the inherent capability, regardless of the trauma that we've experienced, we have the inherent capability to dissipate trauma. And there are papers and there's all sorts of interesting research literature on biological dissipation. And so we can do that. We've got to learn how to dissipate and do that on our own. And that's why I think the contemplative neuroscience field and community is a really great way, because with trauma, Brian, for me, the central problem is that the trauma resolution community in general, and I don't want to say this about everybody, they're not teaching people how to turn inward properly, how to manage their 5 sense gates, how to manage excessive thoughts and mentation. They're not turning inward and learning how to manage their emotional outbursts better, not getting rid of them, but they're also not turning inward, learning how to manage these wild concepts that generate polarity, good, bad, evil, all of that. We've got to start ratcheting down. And that is a spiritual process. And I think the spiritual process of trauma resolution really involves the turn inward and the learning of contemplative neuroscience and contemplative practices, so that we can self-organize and self-heal and manage our lives much better, much better. This is the problem when somebody gets a cancer diagnosis. They go into diagnosis shock. This is commonly written about. And the reason they go into diagnosis shock is that they haven't learned how to turn inward and deal with fear. The central underlying problem of trauma is the notion of fear and the fear of death. So taking fear head on and learning to be with it, learning to work with your fear, you've got to go inside. Going inside also means that you've got to learn how to be outside, and you've got to learn how to manage your 5 sense gates in an environment that's open and spacious. And I live by the ocean, so I'm constantly in the world of nature, because we know from the research literature on forest bathing in Japan and Your Brain on Nature, that book came out years ago, how valuable it is that our attention span and our brain can change when we're just out in the world of nature. So, but to be in the world of nature, you've got to be able to turn inward and see how it's affecting your embodiment inwardly. And that's the key point right now, that inner embodiment, or what's called interoceptive awareness.
The insula.
Yeah, the insula. The insula is the first metabolic, the first anatomical fold of the developing brain in the embryo. That's the beginning, is the insula right there. All this information about trauma is going through the insula, through the first fold, and then through the brainstem and that whole polyvagal complex.
Well, One of the things that was striking in the book is that in PTSD, you do cite some research literature that in PTSD and after a trauma, that the gut lining, that the endothelia becomes more transparent. And then you integrate that into a narrative about the evolutionary development of the nervous system through sponges and so on, and the morphology of sponges over time and stuff like that. And resistance, passivity, transparency being the first stage. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, and I think all of this whole narrative is a place where we most definitely meet, Michael, is that there's a challenge to this obsession with dissociation. That dissociation is a bad thing. That I think subconsciously therapists these days are kind of installing a consciousness police or a consciousness policing regime, such that dissociation is like the bad thing that we need to root out or something like that. You're bad, dissociation is bad, let's get rid of it. And then you make the case from an evolutionary perspective that dissociation is just in the fabric, and also trauma is in the fabric. But maybe you could walk us through this. Okay, like trauma happens and then the gut lining becomes more transparent. Like, how do you weave that into this bigger sea sponge thing? Can you try to
Thank you, Brian. The greater sea sponge thing,
You can create a
Well, first of all, all right, so the teacher in me has to come out. So the lining of the intestines is called the epithelium, all right? And the epithelium of the small and large intestine and the stomach is also lined with 80% of our immune system. And the molecular switching mechanism from innate to acquired immunity is in the lining of the gut. When you eat junk food, processed food, lots of sugar, lots of carbohydrates, or when you have a trauma, because the trauma, what the trauma does to the intestine is it creates a lot of loose junctions so that you start letting go of a lot of waste, and you start getting the body prepared for an inflammatory process. But the contemporary body is not able to get rid of the waste. That's the problem. So the epithelial lining with the junk food and with the trauma, the fenestrations, which means the gap junctions between the cells of the epithelium, they widen and they let molecules through that are a different size that have no business being in the body. There's a lot of molecules in the food that people eat that were not designed for human consumption, and our genetics in our bodies do not know what to do with them. So it creates an inflammatory process. Mm-hmm. And that inflammatory process then starts in the blood vessels right on the other side of the epithelium. And the blood vessels, and especially the endothelium that I mentioned earlier, goes from a dynamic stillness state, and it also has to expand. It also becomes inflamed, and that inflammation spreads throughout the cardiovascular system. And then depending on your epigenetics, if you've got a history of dementia in your family, if you've got a history of heart disease, then that's what your system will likely choose in terms of a long-term result of this metabolic challenge that you're dealing with, including trauma. Trauma can lead to these particular dynamics. So consequently, with trauma, then maybe we need to clean up our diet. Maybe we need to start reducing the amount of carbohydrates and sugar and so forth. So different ways of, let's say, just working with trauma in general. So that are metabolically involved. So that's the basic essence right there. that you've got the lining, the epithelium, it changes from trauma and from food trauma, because that's what I'm calling it, Brian. It's food trauma. And it's a category of trauma that's not even talked about in the trauma resolution community. It is food trauma. I have been following the USDA food science since the 1970s. I know this stuff pretty well, and I know how the government functions, and I also have written books about it, and I know about the diet piece, and I know about the trauma piece in general. But I'm just trying to give the long and short of it that we've got to go down a different path, and that path to healing our trauma is going to have to also include the gut and starting to heal the gut. But that also means healing the heart, because that inflammatory process is going to end up at the heart. And that's going to interfere with our spiritual process. It's going to interfere with our emotional process and so forth. I have just gotten that piece out, Brian. And so give me a lead in terms of the next thing, your question. That's the key right there.
It's the transparency piece that and the dissociation, and reframing dissociation.
Yes.
Right. Because I'm thinking about, dissociation is an intelligent response to a horrible situation. It's kind of like a gaseous consciousness that ejects the self into like a third person awareness. And that third person awareness is helpful to navigate a trauma tablio. And it shows in the literature that, doing trauma, and this is why I've done so much research on the neuroscience of mental imagery. What they find in the literature, what they express in the literature is that starting from a third person perspective is where it's at in terms of safety. You got to meet a person where they're at in that dissociative space. Right. And I think what you're trying to say with the evolutionary science is that, early sea sponges were doing stuff like this with the transparency piece. So that's my softball pitch.
Yeah. So just to finish that one piece, so that, the trauma then creates those fenestrations and the gaps between the cells in order to flush the system. But the system now can't be flushed. A sea sponge could do it quite easily. And that's where I believe we retain that evolutionary capacity. And maybe all we have to do after a trauma is take an enema. I'm not trying to make fun of the whole thing, but that we have to rethink it. And we don't really know that much about the trauma at this metabolic level. Brian, I am absolutely with you on the dissociation piece. It has driven me crazy. D.W. Winnicott wrote a beautiful essay on the value of depression. And I remember reading that and I went, that's it. And I wrote a chapter in one of my early books on the value of dissociation. And what I found out in the literature that I was looking at is that traditional cultures never pathologized dissociation because it was always associated with a healing event, with a spiritual evolution, and that you needed to go through that phase of dissociation for your own phase, for your own spiritual development, or just for a time out, and do fire gazing where you just dissociate and let your consciousness go. Brian, the problem, it's a cultural problem. The corporate culture that we have insists, and this is the other problem with trauma as well. You have to get back on the production line by the end of the week and start and keep creating the widgets, keep creating the cars, keep creating all of this crap. And I believe that the trauma resolution community unconsciously has bought into, let's get people back on the production line because the corporations need their money and you got to pay your mortgage payments. So let's have you do mindfulness meditation so you don't have to blame the work environment for the problems you're having. You get to blame it on yourself. It drives me crazy. So the piece on dissociation is a very traditional, well-known traditional method that's necessary for our human nature to heal, to be in relationship with one another, and to be in a spiritual world. If you want to contact and be in relationship with the next world, and I've seen it with children who are in a vegetative state, these children have a foot in one world. You're looking at children that are chronically dissociated, but you can't pathologize that in a child. Give me a break. So that means that they have a foot in the transpersonal world. They have a foot in the divine world, and they're already there, half and half. I've seen it over and over again. For me, dissociation is the stepping, is the bridge to the divine world. And until we get that and accept that, it's going to be difficult. And yes, there are forms of dissociation that are particularly challenging. I understand that. But they're probably in the long run wouldn't get diagnosed as a dissociative disorder if we had a different way of looking at it.
Yeah.
So I'm totally in agreement with you. I love my dissociation, but I know when I'm in it and I'm okay with it. And that's what happened when that terrorist bomb happened. I didn't realize until I did prolonged exposure therapy at the VA 4 years ago, and we're talking about 50 years post, that I was dissociated from that event of that third person ability to see Colonel Bloomquist and my consciousness up with him, having a dialogue with him in the location that he was at. He was in one of the tree limbs above of the officers club where I was at. That's a 50-year dissociation. But when I overcame that, I was immediately ejected into a spiritual domain in which my heart opened, and I had the felt sense of compassion that I'd never had before. All of that might be associated with that type of experience.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this phrase, walkers of worlds, that these children, they with one foot in each world, that they walk between worlds, that the healer is an initiate, initiate into walking between worlds. And yeah, and I was also thinking about this idealistic implicit assumption that sort of like the person at the top of the hierarchy or the lineage bearer for whatever craniosacral regime or spiritual regime, that the ideal therapist is the one who never dissociates. It's like, is that really a thing that we want to hold in front of us when actually dissociation is a natural part of having a fucking imagination?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. And I tell my students, I said, look, there's a point in every session where your consciousness does leave and you dissociate. And that's so that the client has the therapeutic space, a larger space in which the therapeutic impression can occur for them, whatever that might mean for them, a spiritual potency or just a rest. Mm-hmm. And then that consciousness comes back in when you become aware of it. There is nothing pathological about that at all. I call that my Amazon Prime mind. I'm with a client sometimes, and I'm always trying to figure out what's the next thing I want to order on Amazon as a reward for doing the session on the client. I don't know. I have this crazy little reward thing. So I'm with a client, and that's the way I dissociate. I'll go, should I get that can of roasted salted peanuts? And I could have it overnight, because it's got the good peanut oil in it instead of that awful canola oil. And boom, I'm back, but something has happened, So I call that my Amazon Prime mind. I dissociated to Amazon in terms of ordering. And there are other ways in which there's recreational fantasies, there's rumination that occurs. And Brian, that's why we have to come into relationship with our ordinary mind. We're talking about ordinary mind, the ordinary mind that just dissociates, that ruminates, and how we come back into relationship with that when our attention has been captured and we want to come back. And some of that is therapeutic for the client. And we have to know when it's not therapeutic, when we're just killing time, when we're wasting time, and when we're ruminating too much. And we have to have the skillful mean and the self-discipline to bring ourselves back. And that's a dance that you can't diagnose with any therapist. It happens naturally either way. And you just have to recognize and come back. It doesn't make any difference. Just recognize, come back, reorient, and settle. That's really the basic process.
And have a sense of humor about it. God
Whoa.
damn it.
Whoa.
So, to just kind of like continue that Winnicott thread, and and I love your well, you're the teacher, friend, helper, amazing person that helped me to fall in love with embryology as a spiritual path. And I'm forever indebted to you, Michael, for that. Okay. That actually embryology science now, and nerding out at the finest molecular genetics and morphogenetic stuff, and being on the cutting edge of research there, is actually a spiritual practice for me. And you kind of initiated me into that through your writing and through how this research bridges into practice. And and then that entails not just embryology, but like, how did an embryo, like the mystery of the first embryo, like in the Cambrian Ocean, which has been my trip recently. And, that happened on the wake of an enormous trauma, planetary, trauma to the ancient tubular sponges in the Ediacaran Ocean. So like, there's this huge trauma that happened to the tubes, tubular trauma, I call it.
Yeah. Tubular trauma. I like that. I wouldn't use that.
Which downstream then, eventually paved the way for the first embryo. And so it's not, I suppose it's not intuitive to the average listener. Why would thinking about this stuff and researching this stuff, why would it be important for being a healing practitioner? Like, what are we about as weirdos that study embryology at a really granular level?
We are weirdos studying embryology. Brian, I wrote that stuff in the book, and in one of my other diatribes is I try to undo, a lot of the romantic notions that people have about embryology and pre and perinatal development, because some of that I see, I interpret, and I judge, and I claim that, that there's a lot of romantic notions. And so I think it's a romantic notion to look at the evolution, but not to make that big of a deal of it. And I think we have a relationship, we have a molecular relationship with all beings on the planet. There is a part of our organism in terms of somatic psychology, there is a part of our organism that has the exact same molecular processes as every single sentient being on the planet, as every single being and organism that was ever on the planet. So in that way, embodiment is about right now. I need to relate to my body. It has these ancient practices, and I need to be able to support my own healing that evolved over time so that I can manage, my own embodiment process. But I think also, the embodiment part is a critical part to this. And I mentioned earlier that the molecules that we're talking about, they go into a still point. And really, that's how we align with all beings and all sentient beings and the equality of all sentient beings on the planet. But at the same time, as human beings, since we don't specialize at the end of the embryonic period, we specialize in a lot of things like trauma, but we also specialize in being. We're the only mammal that can specialize in being.
I thought we specialized in producing opinions, Michael.
Well, that's the trauma paradigm, Brian. So it's the opinions that get us into trouble, and then wanting to traumatize somebody else. You're wrong. You're blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. So yeah, absolutely. And all of those it's such a romantic, world that we live in, to romanticize good versus evil, because that's what's happening. It's this big romance with politics.
Yeah. Well, I like being silly. And I don't know if that may be one of the reasons why I decided to do a deep dive into cilia. Okay. Silly, because cilia, as you know, Michael, are at the origins of the central nervous system.
Yeah.
They are ciliomotor circuitry, like in terms of those ancient swimmers, and paramecium and stuff like that. They have two phases: sinking or swimming, flapping or being quiescent. Okay. Which is now my teaching tool now when I'm teaching students about sympathetic, parasympathetic is that, let's just hold in front of us this really basic image of an ancient swimmer within that is either flapping or sinking. And flapping doesn't mean bad. Flapping does not mean bad. Okay. The sympathetic system has totally been thrown out as just like the fight flight system. And we should be, go slow or you're not being spiritual.
Brian, thank you, because in my life right now, I've started specializing in being silly. Now, I bought a domain name with a student of mine who's a professional clown, was a professional clown. And I bought the domain name last summer after I had to withdraw from the Craniosacral Therapy Association of North America for political reasons. And
Okay. I'd love to hear that story.
We don't need to get into that.
I'd like to.
No, I know, but
Okay. We'll go somewhere else. Maybe we'll talk about that offline.
Yeah. Well, when people lose their sense of humor, I'm out of there. So at any rate, we bought a domain name called firstlaugh.fun. And in the entertainment industry, the new websites are .fun websites. And I want to create a situation where we find humor in people's suffering. Where can we help people find the humor in their suffering? Because I have found in my own life, because I specialize in working and having trauma patients for years. They would fly in 3 days. It would be a 3-day protocol. I'd work with them. And I realized what I was doing, Brian, over that 3 days is I was trying to find where's the moment where they had self-reflective consciousness and could lighten up and get a smile on their face. Firstlaugh.fun is because in the Navajo tradition that I studied, you don't get baptized in the Navajo tradition until the parents see the first smile, the first laugh in the baby. Then they get baptized. So everything is done attachment and bonding to support that child till you get the first laugh. So that's the name of the website. And then I've created two characters. I've created a character called Beauregard O'Shaughnessy III, in which I'm going to be a pothead who's mildly also drunk on really good French wine, because Beauregard means pleasing to look at. And I'm Irish, so the O'Shaughnessy thing comes in. And Beauregard is going to be giving talks about health and healing from a biodynamic perspective, especially about the politics that he observes in the community, not just in North America, but, around the world. So I'm developing other sketches and going to want to build this into either an Instagram account or start with a link on my webpage where I put up funny clips about healing. And then I just write a paragraph on why I think this is funny and that people really ought to look at it. Have you seen Bob Newhart's piece on his TV show?
Stop it.
When he uses, yes.
Stop it.
That's classic. That is a classic skit. That's the first thing that I think should be put up.
Yeah.
In terms of that. So again, back to our discussion of trauma resolution. I don't want to minimize people's trauma. There's heinous trauma out there. I understand that. But we need to find a different gate, a different veil to move through, to move the paradigm. And the paradigm needs to move. And humor can be included in that, as well as the other things we've talked about.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Trickster mythology is one of I think I devote over 100 pages in my book to trickster mythology and trickster dynamics, because we've got to keep play in the space. And because, spiritual healing ends up sliding into this trauma discourse has become traumatizing, which is utterly humorless.
Right.
And also spiritual pompousness is utterly humorless as well. And I don't know, have you ever seen any spiritual pompousness in the biodynamic community, Michael? Or anyway, but so it's weird, that I was thinking, there's all these ignition and ignition and ignition. What about laughter ignition?
Right.
You know what I mean? Because we talk about ignition as it ends up being kind of an inflated concept in a way. But I was thinking about this Navajo baptism moment. This is an ignition moment. And my gosh, why isn't laughter ignition held just as sacred as any other ignition?
Thank you for that, because I need to find a rationale when I start writing about this, that it's not just an anti-political slug that I'm doing, with the humor, but really it is about healing, become lighthearted. Brian, it's interesting. When I wrote that heart book, it actually took 10 years to write. And when it got down to the nitty gritty, every 30 minutes, I would get up, I would go to Instagram or YouTube and look at humorous shorts, and I wouldn't go forward with the book until I was crying with laughter at what I was looking at. So I have looked at a lot of humor, and again, I'm totally in agreement with you. We've lost our sense of humor, and for healing, we need to bring that back. For embodiment, we need to bring that back. Our sense gates are completely polluted with over seriousness.
And you talk about developing awe as well. So like humor and awe. And to me, again, I want to double down on this. I think, based on my lived experience, my felt sense, that my felt sense of awe is almost always accompanied by the tinkle response, involuntary piloerection, the goosebump response.
Right.
Does that clock with you? Does that connect with your lived experience when you're in deep moments of healing with clients, or teaching? Yes. When weird stuff is happening and you're in that Holy Spirit space?
First of all, my answer is yes. I do have those experiences of the goosebumps. I think in terms of perceptual dynamic, I have several other ways in which I enter that domain. That's one of the domains that alerts me to this extraordinary unit of consciousness and the possibility that my mind has just suspended its thought process. I'm empty of any emotion that I might have had for the last 3 minutes, and that my conceptual mind has dissipated into neither a singularity or a plurality. And I love that, because, Brian, this is our innate capacity. This is what is known, and this is why religions clamp that down. My essence with that book and all the work that I'm teaching and doing right now, it's direct experience. We need to cultivate a culture of direct experience. Get out of the corporate mindset. Get out of the religious mindset. Get out of having a gatekeeper. Yes, we need help, but not someone that's going to abuse their power and authority over us, but someone who's going to support our sovereignty, our agency, and our ability to self-heal and take responsibility for our body. Brian, my belief is that what you and I do is the greatest act of anarchy on the planet Earth right now. We know that from Wilhelm Reich and the whole history with somatic psychology. No political system wants people to have control of their bodies. We have got to take control of our bodies. That's why I'm in this business at a deeper philosophical level, but also at the embodied level. I want to help people take control of their own bodies. And all of these experiences are gateways into that level of awareness of agency, ownership, sovereignty of our body, but also our mind and the unity of mind, body, spirit that Andrew Taylor Still talked about. We have to return to that. Religion, and in the Catholic religion and the medical science community in the Renaissance, as you know, they split it, they cut a deal. I understand that. We got to bring it back together. It's killing us. It's absolutely killing people. And we've got to do this, and it's anarchistic because it's anti-governmental, it's anti-corporate, it's anti-religious. So we can have a direct experience of our own divinity as it lives within us and how we relate with it outwardly. Absolutely. It's right there in the moment.
That goes right into my heart. Right into my heart. And the ignition, it's a limbic ignition. You know, it brings the tears. The tears are kind of, you know, just underneath. It's really beautiful.
Yeah. Right.
So you're living what you're writing about, cardiovascular biodynamics.
Yes.
You know, you've given birth to a new thing, a new way, a new approach, cardiovascular biodynamics, the biodynamics of the heart, and you're living it. You're right inside my heart right now.
You know, that is the essence right there. I mean, because I've spent so much time with 45 years of study of Tibetan medicine and now studying it more deeply, the meditation practices that Tibetan doctors do. So my work now is involved in adding what I'm calling the third biodynamic aptitude. So we have an aptitude for slowness, we have an aptitude for stillness, and the aptitude for visualizing the 5 healing colors of Tibetan medicine and the importance of those colors and their effect that they can have on the metabolism of the body. So in that book, you know, the Heart book, there's a lot about that type of visualization and the importance of that as an aptitude. It's a spiritual aptitude that we can grow into and we can develop. And it's exceedingly important because it's medical. This is medical knowledge from the East, and it's extremely valuable.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, I want to do some writing with you about laughter ignition. I'm thinking about the endocannabinoid system. I'm thinking about the fluid dynamics of the body and how the fluid dynamics in the heart and the diaphragm are fluctuating while we're laughing.
Yes,
You know,
yes, exactly.
It's got to be anti-inflammatory.
Right.
You know, it's got to be parasympathetic in a different way, in a sort of paradoxical way, even though it's an active thing. And you would think that it has sympathetic components because there's so much going on.
Well, we already know the value of laughter in terms of the autonomic nervous system. And as soon as we get to know the metabolism of the autonomic nervous system and that our blood vessels are governed by the sympathetic nervous system, not the parasympathetic, we're back to a deeper understanding of the metabolism of trauma, but also the value of humor because of the way in which humor balances the autonomic nervous system. So, Brian, I can see that you're going to be a regular contributor to FirstLaugh.fun.
Yeah, I like to say, you know, the sympathetic system shouldn't just be the fight-flight system. It should be the fight-flight-frolic system.
Yes. Oh, I thank you for that. Let me write that down. The fight, fright, frolic. Yes. Because we all know what the 4 F's mean. Frolic. I'm going to use that. Thank you.
Well, you know, and then when the student comes back to do a podcast with his teacher and the teacher is taking some notes, I know I'm doing pretty good and you know you're doing pretty good and we're happy, I think.
Brian, thank you for that. And I also want to say that I'd like to continue a private dialogue with you. Maybe you have a contribution to my new embryology book that you could make based on maybe an excerpt from your book that's coming out. I don't know what the mechanics are.
I'd love to do that. I'd love to talk about cilia. I did the deep dive into cilia. I studied the spiritual tradition, for example, of Swedenborg, who actually Swedenborg, did you know that Swedenborg, Emanuel Swedenborg, nailed 4 out of the 5 core osteopathic principles that Stills threw down in his original osteopathy. So Swedenborg was a brain anatomist.
He's a very, very important component within that whole osteopathic community. He was a huge influence on Sutherland, especially.
Yeah.
So, absolutely.
So I go at length into the periaqueductal gray and the cilia nucleus there in the periaqueductal gray, and talk at length about cilia. And I'd just love to, speak more about that and write about it, because and it's just so silly, right?
You've inspired me to add something about humor in the embryo book, but also I'd love to see the references to that. Is it a 10-hour?
Yeah, Richard Gordon. Yes, Richard Gordon, the great embryologist, he's really mapped out long tide the way that I have become passionate about, which is 11 to 12-hour tide that signals master gene folders in a kind of binary way. There's either an expansion tide, and then if an expansion tide is moving through the embryo as a whole, then it will open up an entire genetic file folder, expansion tide file folder, with an enormous index of different gene systems and gene regulatory networks. And then there's a contraction phase, a contraction wave that takes about 11 to 12 hours, that then signals an enormous file folder of contraction in an entire index of gene regulatory networks that only respond to contraction waves.
Now, have you written about this in your new book that's forthcoming?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'd love to see the references, just so that I could add in some statements about that, maybe not the whole chapter or whatever. Let's continue this dialogue, because can you send me some references?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. Okay. Let's talk offline. As a matter of fact, I'll just click stop in a moment. Is there anything that any like final comment? I'd like you to have the last word, besides, I'll say just, I love you and thank you. And thank you for being on the show. Is there anything that you'd like to send our listeners off with?
Brian, I think the thing that I mentioned, we have this innate right for direct experience. Regardless of our life experience, we can have direct experience of our own divinity as it lives in the heart. And I think that's really one of the key messages right here. And the other message is, if you're physically and metabolically not well, you have got to start taking ownership of your body. And this is, it's a horrible death. And I'm not saying people are going to have a horrible death, but when you have metabolic problems, it can lead to a very difficult dying process. And so I want to encourage people to take ownership of your body, and that means cleaning up your diet metabolically. Thank you. Brian, you're awesome.
You too, Michael. All right, I'm going to click stop. Thanks so much for coming on the Boundless Body.
Thank you for listening to the Boundless Body Podcast. Please like us, share, subscribe, and until next time, stabilize, catalyze, and thrive